Hello, Namo Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dharma TV English program. I am Lisa Chu. Today we will start with a wonderful Dharma talk by a popular monk, followed by a good piece of music from wayfarers, and concluding with a Dhammapada sermon. Today we begin our program with a popular and respected Buddhist monk from Australia, also known as Venerable Savati Dhammika. He was born in Australia in 1951 and ordained as a Buddhist monk in India. Later lived in Sri Lanka, where he became well known for his efforts to propagate the peaceful teachings of the Buddha. Venerable Dhammika is a prolific writer and has written a large number of books, mainly focusing on the Buddha's life, his mission, his noble teaching, and the practice. Let's respectfully listen to his sermon and gain wisdom. Please make sure you listen to this three-part sermon mindfully and with due devotion. The topic of his sermon is Life of the Buddha according to the holy texts.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Victor Wee, for that very nice introduction. And those who are listening, when Victor says how wonderful I am, I actually have to pay him to say that. Okay.
I'm just joking, of course.
Okay, Vesak is coming up, and so this is an appropriate subject for the talk that I'm going to give tonight. And also because for the last 4 years I've been working on this book. On the other hand, in a sense, I've been writing the book for the last 30 years. Since I became a Buddhist in my late teens, I've always been fascinated by the personage of the Buddha, and it's his teachings that have pretty much guided my life ever since I became a Buddhist when I was about 19. And so 4 years ago, I decided to put together all of the things that I had learned, the things that I had read from the Tipitaka, but also from the writings of others, and write a book about the life of the Buddha, perhaps looking at his life from a completely different point of view than has usually been done. And if you look at any life of the Buddha, either a book or an article in an encyclopedia, they're all pretty much the same. They are what you call a narrative biography, starting with his birth, then his childhood, and then his youth, and then his early adulthood, and then his enlightenment, and his career throughout his life, and his death. From birth to death narrative. In fact, I've never read a book on the life of the Buddha, and I have read many, many of them, that doesn't present this approach. But of course, for many years, I have been aware that there is no such life to death biography of the Buddha in the Pali Tipitaka. So if you look at the Gospels of Jesus, for example, most of them start with his birth, and then they skip over his youth, and then his career, which lasted for 3 years, and his death and his resurrection. So it's a journey through time. However, if you want to write a life of the Buddha, you simply can't do that, not from the Pali Tipitaka anyway, because there is no we don't know when any of these events most of the events that are mentioned in the Tipitaka are when they took place. Okay, so I decided to take a completely different approach. But before doing that, I had to look at, how do we know about the Buddha? I mean, where does our information about him come from? And it actually comes from 3 sources. The major source, or a major source, is the Pali Tipitaka. Now, the Pali Tipitaka is the oldest, or it contains the oldest information we know about the Buddha. Okay. So there are lives of the Buddha written in Sanskrit, as Victor said, the first one being the Lalita Vistara, and later on there was Ashvagota's Buddha Charita and works like this. But these were written many hundreds of years after the Buddha. So the Pali Tipitaka, as we have it today, it contains the earliest information we have about the Buddha as a person, about his life, and of course, particularly about what he taught. Now, that's not to say that everything in the Pali Tipitaka is the same age. There are 3 or 4 books in the Khuddaka Nikaya which are really quite late. Some of them may actually have been written in Sri Lanka. But it's fairly easy based on the contents and the language used, to see which parts of the Tipitaka are earlier and which parts are later. So that's the first source. The second source is the legends. Once again, as Victor said, probably the most important collection of legends about the Buddha, and the earliest one after the Tipitaka, is what's called the Mahavastu, which is an absolutely fascinating book. In actual fact, it's more like a library. It contains all sorts of information, some very early, some of a middle period, some later, all sorts of, it's a great big mess, but it's a fascinating mess. And many of the things that we think we know about the Buddha came from the Mahavastu, and then there are later works written in Sanskrit up to about the 4th and 5th century. Okay, and then you have the much later Mahayana Sutras, where they are teaching things that have their origins in the earliest teachings, but are certainly developments of those, including supposed incidents and things that the Buddha did. And then finally we have, and this may surprise you, we have legends that were developed in the last 100, 200 years. I'll give you just one example of this. Some of you may know there's a wonderful story about the Buddha where once he was going along the road to Rajagaha, and he came across a shepherd leading a flock of sheep along the road. And as he approached this flock of sheep, there was one lamb at the very back of the flock, because it was limping. There was something wrong with its leg. It had an injured leg. So as he approached the flock, he picked up this lamb and carried it until he got to the shepherd. And he asked the shepherd, "Where are you taking these sheep?" And he said, "I'm taking them to Rajagaha because King Bimbisara is having a great sacrifice. The animals are going to be sacrificed to the gods." So the story continues that the Buddha followed the flock of sheep, and then he talked King Bimbisara out of slaughtering all of these animals, and that's the story. It's a lovely story, and sometimes you see pictures of it in books. I've seen it once painted on the walls of a temple in Sri Lanka, and it's a lovely story, but nobody knows where it comes from. It certainly doesn't come from the Tipitaka. It isn't in the Tipitaka. There's no record of it in any Sanskrit literature, or in fact any Buddhist literature at all. It actually comes from Edwin Arnold's book, The Light of Asia, written in the 1860s, the 1870s. Now, it's quite okay for a poet to invent a story about the Buddha. What I find surprising is many Buddhists, including many monks, think that it's an authentic story about the Buddha. Okay, and nowadays, if you turn on look at some videos on YouTube and what have you about the Buddha, once again you'll find some fascinating stories. Most of them really quite positive, but none of them are from Buddhist literature, either early Buddhist literature or later Buddhist literature. In other words, my point is that legends about the Buddha are still being created. Okay, so we have these 3 sources: the sources from the Pali Tipitaka, which are the earliest and most authentic. Then we have later, mainly Sanskrit literature, and we even have a few legends being created nowadays. I decided to use in my book only the information from the Tipitaka. And straight away that presented me with a problem. As I just said, there is no birth to death story, narrative story about the life of the Buddha in the Tipitaka. So what are you going to do? So what I decided to do is simply go through the Tipitaka, pick out every single reference to something that the Buddha did, or what he said, or what happened to him, and put it all in order, so that it is not a birth to death biography, but rather a biography of a person. Okay, so in a sense, this created another problem for me. Most of the things that we think we know about the Buddha are not to be found in the Tipitaka itself. So, for example, there are many stories very widely circulating about the Buddha's birth. One of them, for example, is that the Buddha's mother gave birth when she was a virgin. Another one is that she had a dream of a white elephant. Lovely stories, but not to be found in the Tipitaka. And then everybody knows, even school children who are not Buddhists know that the Buddha was a prince and his father was a king. And there is no evidence for that either. Certainly, it seems that his father was from a ruling class family, and he certainly probably was a chief, an elected chief of the Sakyans, at least for some period, but he wasn't a king in the sense that we think about kings nowadays, and we think about what kings were for hundreds of years, okay? Likewise, Kapilavastu is supposed to have been a great city, a great capital city. Now, there are two contenders for archaeological contenders for Kapilavastu today. One is a place called Piparoa, which is in India, just a few kilometers from the Indian border. And the other one is just a few kilometers across the Indian border in Nepal, and that's called Tilorakot. Whichever one is the real one, both of them are very modest places. They are certainly not great cities. They're nothing like New York, nothing like London. They are little more than large villages. Okay, so there is no evidence that the Buddha's father was a king, that he was a prince, and that he lived in a great metropolitan city. Okay. One thing that I find rather interesting too is that we have virtually no information about the Buddha's childhood, about his youth, or about his early adulthood. In fact, we only have 2 or 3 very brief pieces of information. One of them is the story about the sage Asita. So the story goes that Asita heard from the Devas that a wonderful boy had been born to the chief of the Sakyans. And so he went to Kapilavastu and he was given the child to hold. And because he was an expert in marks, bodily marks, auspicious marks on the body, he predicted, well, everybody knows that he predicted this child will become either a great spiritual leader or a great political leader, either a Buddha, an enlightened sage, or a Chakravartin, a universal statesman, a universal monarch. Wonderful story, but only half of that story is in the Tipitaka. Okay, so according to the Tipitaka's account, he simply predicted that the child would become a great spiritual teacher. He never mentioned anything about becoming a great political leader. Then when the only other 2 pieces of information is we are told that by the Buddha himself, later in his life, he was reminiscing about his childhood, and he mentioned that he had 3 palaces, or 3, We can't call them palaces because he wasn't a king. Bungalows or villas, perhaps, certainly probably very nice houses because his father was quite wealthy and politically powerful. And the other one was that he had a staff of dancing girls and what have you, which would have been quite typical for a person of his class at that time. Other than that, we have no information whatsoever. We don't know whether he was married. We don't know who his wife was. Everybody will tell you that the Buddha's wife was called Yasodhara. That name is not to be found anywhere in the Tipitaka. Okay, so we have virtually no information whatsoever about the Buddha's childhood, his youth, and his early adulthood. Okay. Then probably the most iconic story in the Buddha's life is the four signs. So the story goes that his father, the great king Siddhodana, was because Asita had predicted that his son would become either a great spiritual leader or a great political leader. Naturally enough, being a king, he wanted his son to become a great political leader. So he confined him to a beautiful palace so that he would know nothing about the ugly aspects of life. But one day he managed to sneak out of the palace in his chariot, and he saw, or he encountered, an old person, somebody who was very sick, a body being taken for cremation, and finally a wandering ascetic. And it was these four sights that made him decide that he would renounce the world and become a wandering ascetic in search of truth. Wonderful story. And it's a great pity that the story is not in the Tipitaka, because it's such a beautiful, iconic, and meaningful story. But unfortunately, it's not to be found in the Tipitaka. Then we've got things like probably one of the most spectacular stories, which everybody believes happened to the Buddha, was the miracle of Sankasya. In Sri Lanka, there is a wonderful, now ruined temple built about 1,000 years ago. And on one wall, high up on the wall, it has a huge painting depicting this event. If you go to Sanchi, on one of the gateways of the Great Stupa at Sanchi, which dates from about the 1st century BC, you get a depiction of this wonderful miracle that the Buddha is supposed to have done. So the story is that at one time the Buddha decided to spend the rainy season, the Vassa, by going up to heaven and teaching his mother the Abhidhamma in heaven. Now, I'm not a great fan of the Abhidhamma. I find it rather dull. So I always joke that if his poor mother had to listen to the Abhidhamma for 3 months, it would have turned heaven into hell. Whatever the case is, that after his 3 or 4 months up in heaven, a golden ladder, or actually 3 ladders, one of gold, one of silver, and one of crystal, appeared in the sky, something like a huge escalator perhaps, and the Buddha came down with Indra, the god Indra, on one side, holding an umbrella above him, and the god Brahma on the other side, and he came down to earth like that. Now that is a miracle. That's a bit more spectacular than walking on the water or turning water into wine. That really is a miracle. And this is but one of the most popular miracles for thousands of years. There have been poems written about it. There are paintings of it. It is recited and talked about and widely believed, but it's not to be found in the Tipitaka. So here we have a problem. If you want to write a biography of the Buddha, you find that you have, if you want to write a birth to death narrative, you find that you simply don't have the information. So what are you going to do? So this is what I did. I went through the Tipitaka and I picked out every piece of information that pointed to something about the person of the Buddha himself, his character, his habits, his travels, how he debated with his opponents and Brahmins who came, or other ascetics who came to debate with him, how he taught, the techniques that he used as a teacher to transmit his teaching, his relationships with his disciples, his attitude towards his opponents, those who criticized him. What else? All sorts of things. And I decided to get all of that information and put it all together and present the life of the Buddha from that point of view. And this is what I did. It took me 4 years. I only finished really about a month ago, and I'm still fiddling with it a little bit. Okay. And these are some of the things that I discovered. The first thing I discovered is the seemingly wide difference between the Buddha of common perception and the Buddha as he is presented in the Tipitaka. So the Buddha as he is widely believed to be is certainly not in the Theravadan tradition anyway, not in the Pali tradition. He's certainly not considered to be like a divine being or a divine principle as he is in some later Mahayana traditions. He is very clearly a human being, but you would have to say that he is a superhuman being. So, for example, if we read in the commentaries, in one place in the commentary, it mentions that the Buddha went from here to there. And in Buddhaghosa, in his commentary, he writes, but of course, Buddhas don't walk from here to there. They float a few inches off the ground and they just sort of drift along. All sorts of stories like this. So the Buddha is depicted very much, and certainly traditionally by most Buddhists in traditional Buddhist countries of Asia, see the Buddha very much as a superhuman being. And he is not presented like that in the Tipitaka. One of the most startling stories about him, or incidents about him that I found, and you can look it up in the Anguttara Nikaya. When my book comes out, you can find the reference there, and you can look it up. In one place, the Buddha said, when I'm on a journey, and I have to answer the call of nature to urinate or defecate, I look up the road to see if anybody's coming. And then I look down the road to see if anybody's coming. And then if there's nobody on the road, then I have a poo or a pee. Now, I find that absolutely fascinating. Not because I'm interested in people's bodily motions, but here, those who compiled the Tipitaka were not frightened to mention this, that the Buddha went to the toilet, he had a runny nose, sometimes he sneezed, just like you and me. What made the Buddha different was not superhuman abilities. What made him different was not an extraordinary body. What made him different was his understanding. And that cannot be depicted in art. And therefore, I imagine in ancient times, people tried to express the grandeur of the Buddha, not by paying too much attention to his teachings, but by presenting him sort of as a superhuman being. Now, in the Pali Tipitaka itself, the Buddha is sometimes depicted as talking to the gods, devas. For example, in the Mangala Sutta, a very popular sutta, it says that the Buddha was meditating all night, and then suddenly there was this effulgent light in the forest around him, and a deva came down and asked him a question. So somebody could say, well, that sounds pretty superhuman to me. No devas have ever come down and talked to me. But I think that we can look at it like this. We can say that it's quite possible, even when the Buddha was alive, that people believed that gods came down and talked to him. It's possible that within a very short time of his passing, that people said that gods came down and talked to the Buddha, and there could have been a very good reason for that. First of all, they lived in a world where almost everybody believed in spirits, evil spirits, earth gods, and all sorts of things like that. And generally, they considered them to be extremely powerful and sometimes quite dangerous in the case of some spirits. And so they created stories which demoted the gods. The gods come, the Buddha doesn't go up to heaven to talk to the gods, nor does he get messages from gods. Rather, the gods come down and ask questions for the Buddha. So this was a way of, as it were, demoting the Buddha, demoting the gods while promoting the Buddha. And I think that these stories can be understood like that. Now, if we go to something like the Acharya Bhuta Dhamma Sutta, this is the only discourse in the Tipitaka, it's in the Majjhima Nikaya, where it talks about the Buddha's birth. And it is clearly a somewhat later sutra because it's full of miracles. Not that the Buddha's mother was a virgin or anything like that, but there are certainly miraculous events that are supposed to have happened according to this sutta when the Buddha was born. But I looked at every one of these to see if they had some role in the other religions of the time. And this is what I found. Those of you who know that sutra and will know that according to this sutra, the Buddha's mother gave birth while she was standing. You will often see a depiction of the Buddha's mother standing up, generally holding the branch of a tree, with the Buddha coming out of her right side, the baby Buddha coming out of her right side. It's an interesting story. So I thought, that's very strange. Why should she be holding the branch of a tree? And why should she be standing? Sounds like a very unusual way for a woman to give birth to a child. So I looked it up. The first thing is, in the sutta does not mention that she hanged onto a tree, but it does mention that she gave birth standing. So I have a friend who happens to be a doctor in England, and I asked him if he could give me some information about childbirth practices. In the UK. Prone condition, in a prone position. But apparently until about 200 years ago, only about 150 years, this is in the West at least, only for about 150 years has this become normal. Prior to that, women usually gave birth either crouching, or they used to have a thing called a birthing chair, which was pretty much like a chair, but it had a big hole on it, and the woman would just sit at it and pop, the baby would come out the bottom. Well, maybe not pop, but it would eventually come out the bottom. I have been unable to find any information about childbirth practices in ancient India, but it seems, at least in village life in India today, women usually give birth standing. So when we read this sutta, we think that it is exaggerating or it is telling a tall tale that the Buddha's mother was standing. In actual fact, it's probably very likely that she did give birth standing, because it apparently was a common practice at that time. Then there's another story in that same Acharya Bhuta Dhamma Sutta, where it says that when the Buddha was born, a great effulgent light shot up into the universe. And so powerful was this light that it even was brighter than the light of the sun and the moon. And as a result of that light, the beings that lived in the murky darkness between the world systems, the chakravales, what's the word we use? The galaxies. That's the chakravale. Chakra, of course, means a wheel. So a world system, what we would call a galaxy. The beings that lived in the darkness between the galaxies, because of that light, they could see each other for the first time. And they were able thus to communicate with each other. Now, that is clearly a very exaggerated story. Does the sutra mean that there really was such a light that shot right up into the universe? I doubt it. This seems to me to be an analogy, or a what's called in Indian literature alankara. Alankara is a decorative form meant to transmit a particular idea. And I think that the idea that this is trying to transmit is this, that the coming of a Buddha, not necessarily Prince Siddhartha as a baby, but the coming of a Buddha would bring a light into the world so that people would become aware of each other and perhaps for the first time come to know, or at least have the opportunity to come to know each other, so that there could be communication and from that perhaps empathy towards each other. So looked at from a symbolic point of view, we need not dismiss even some of the exaggerated stories in the Tipitaka as being of no value. Some of them maybe have actually quite deep meanings. Then what I did was I looked at all of the information that it had to say about the Buddha's travels. And this is what we know. We've known this about the Buddha for a long time. Long before the Buddha came into the world, it was the tradition of the wandering ascetics of the time to remain in one place for the 3 or 4 months of the year during the rainy season, and then spend the other 9 months of the year wandering around. The idea was that they would be itinerant for most of their lives. So it is almost certain that the Buddha followed this tradition, and certainly he made it a rule for his monks. So during the Vassa, monks are supposed to stay in one place for that period of time, and then they're supposed to go off and wander for the rest of the year. So then I looked at, is it possible to identify all of the places that the Buddha visited? No, it isn't. The majority of them, we simply don't know where they are anymore. But we do know where some of them are. And with a bit of research, I've been able to find a few other ones like Alavi and Vyanjana and places like that. So I have been able to identify them from looking at archaeological reports. And from then, I've been able to see that the Buddha went from this place to that place and measure the distances between them. And of course, there are some places we already know. For example, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, we are told that in the last year of the Buddha's life, he went from Rajagaha to Pataligamma to Vaishali, and then from there to Kushinara, where he passed away. So we can, without any difficulties at all, we can measure that distance and we can see how far the Buddha walked. And we know that after he was enlightened, he went from Uruvela, which is now Buddha Gaya. He went from Uruvela to Gaya, and then from Gaya to Varanasi, and then from Varanasi to Isipatana. Once again, we know where each of these places are. We can measure the distance between them, so we know how far the Buddha traveled.
Now, let's have a short break and enjoy the music by the Wayfarers. The songs are devotional and full of meaningful guidelines.
Life never dies, although we live in midst of change and death. Only the forms shall pass away,
Now, it is time for the weekly Dhammapada sermon, a collection of sayings of the Buddha, which is one of the best known Buddhist scriptures and most widely read. Here is Professor Bhante Sivali to present a brief sermon on the verse number 114 of the Dhammapada, and it is on the chapter 8.
Namo tas bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhas. Welcome to the Dhammapada program on Buddha Dharma TV. Today we are going to discuss the verse number 114 on chapter 8, thousands. We are going to discuss this verse a little bit in detail because this is associated with a very nice popular story. Most of the Buddhists, even some non-Buddhists, who are familiar with this story, but there are still lots who are not familiar, who must not have heard about this story. But I want to say this story in a brief still, but it is very important to know this story. It has a very beautiful meaning. Once there was a lady by the name of Kisa Gautami. Of course, in India, in ancient India, over 2,565 years ago. The story is very nice story. So I want to tell it to you. Kisa Gautami was her name. And of course, she was a daughter of a rich man from Savatthi, a city called Savatthi. She was known as Kisa Gautami because of her slim body, physical body, slim. Kisa Gautami was married to a rich young man and a son was born to them. The boy died when he was just a toddler. And Kisa Gautami was stricken with grief. She couldn't believe. She was in terrible pain. So she went out of the house carrying the dead body of her son, a baby son. She went about asking for medicine that would restore her son to life. From everyone she happened to meet, she wanted someone who can give life back to her dead baby son. People began to think that she had gone mad. But a wise man, seeing her condition, thought that he should be of some help to her, a kind person, a gentle person. He could understand her pain, her position, a melancholic disposition, a sad situation. Therefore, he offered himself to help her. So he said to her, well, it is not an easy task, but let me tell you one thing. I know for sure he could help you. There is a person called Buddha. He's the only person you should approach. Don't go from house to house. He has the medicine you want. This wise man told her, go and see him. Go and see him. So he encouraged her to go and see the Buddha. So she went to the Buddha and asked him, placing the dead baby son before him, tears rolling down her eyes, in terrible pain, crying. She asked the Buddha if you have any medicine that would restore her dead son life, just to life. The Buddha told her, without saying no, here is a very important psychological treatment. This is the source, the psychology of the Buddha, Buddhist psychology. The Buddha told her to get some mustard seeds from a house where there had been no death. Mustard seeds is a common thing at the time of India, even today. People usually use in every meal in their, it's a kind of delicacy, but they use always mustard seed. It's a kind of herbal. You must have seen small seeds, yellowish small seeds, a treatment. Some people, they say that we can leave a spoonful of mustard seeds in a glass of water overnight and take it in the morning. That will cure your diabetes. So this is what we have heard. But I'm just telling, the Buddha told her that a little bit mustard seeds from a house where there had been no death. She was very happy. She thought, I can get it. So carrying her dead child in her bosom or in her chest, Kisa Gotami went from house to house with the request from some mustard seeds. Everyone was willing to help her, but she could not find a single house where death had not occurred. Unlike today, it has not been easy that houses are not attached to each house. Maybe each house is separate from at least 300 yards, if not half a kilometer at that time. But she went from house to house with the hope that I will get a mustard seed and I go with that Buddha who will be able to restore my dead son to life. That was a hope. Everyone was willing to help her, but she could not find a single house where death had not occurred. Not a single house. Every house she went, she got the message, oh, yes, we have mustard seed, but we never had somebody. But she could not find a single house where death had not occurred. Then she realized that hers was not the only family that had faced death, and that there were more people dead than living. As soon as she realized this, her attitude towards her dead son changed, because she realized death is common to all. It is coming to us sooner or later, but it is there. It will come to me, come to others, and it has come to my baby, sweet baby too. So she also realized that there is no age limit. The death, it comes to elders, youngers, newly born, so there's no age. It can come anytime to me, to you. She realized also that it can come to me too. Therefore, with that understanding, as soon as she realized this, that death is common to all, death is inevitable, death is unavoidable, her attitude towards her dead son completely changed. She was no longer attached to the dead body of her son, even. She was holding dearly with pain. Now she came to know that it is not possible. Death is coming to all. With that understanding, she was no longer attached to the dead body of her baby son. She even left that corpse, the dead body, in the jungle and returned to the Buddha and reported that she couldn't find a house where death had not occurred. She herself realized that the psychological technique that Buddha used was fantastic. Fantastic. The psychology of Buddha is, there's no match. You should know, you should learn a little bit of Buddha's teaching, the psychology, philosophy, psychoanalysts, all these things you find in Buddha's teaching. Here is a very small example. Then, when this Kissa Gautami reported that she could not find a house where death had not occurred, then Buddha said, "Did you not get the single pinch of mustard seed?" She said, "No, that did I not." "Venerable," she said, means, "Venerable, I did not get." In every village, the dead are more in number than the living, said the Buddha. Buddha, vainly did you imagine that you alone had lost a child. You thought that way. But all living beings are subject to an unchanging law. What is this law? And it is this. Buddha said, the death, the prince of death, like a raging torrent, sweeps away into the sea of ruin all living beings. All living beings. See, with their longings still unfulfilled, they die. Then Buddha addressed her, "Gautami, you thought that you were the only one who had lost a son?" Kissa Gautami attentively listening, but reduced grief and pain. As you have now realized, death comes to all beings before their desires are fulfilled. Death takes them away. Lots of people have dreams, hopes, expectations, imaginations. All they end up at death or in death. So, see, as you have now realized, death comes to all beings before their desires are fulfilled. Because we build a lot of dreams, expectations, before we realized fully, death comes to us. On hearing this, Kisa Gautami fully realized the impermanent nature of the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and insubstantiality of the aggregates, and attained Sota Patti fruition, the first stage of the enlightenment. And so fast things happen. It doesn't take much. But of course, if the right time, right place, right moment, right Dharma is there, you all can attain. Are we ready? Are we prepared? Is our brain is capable of grasping all these things, meaning in its proper sense? Then we will, of course, can attain at least the first stage of the enlightenment called Sota Patti fruition. When this Kisa Gautami attained that level, when she attained that level, Sota Patti, first stage of the enlightenment, soon after that, Kisa Gautami became a nun. She is compelled, not forced by, but they never did it. It is against the Buddha's teaching, Buddhism, to force others to embrace converts. No, we don't convert people. We do not bribe people to become a follower of Buddha. No, that is not Buddhism. That is the excellent feature of Buddhism. Anybody can be a follower of anybody's religion. You don't have to give it up, but you can practice Buddha's teaching. You don't have to be a Buddhist. Understanding has nothing to do with religion. Those all are labels. Whether you call a Christian, Hindu, Muslims, Jewish, or Buddhist. All these are labels. Understanding, knowledge, vision has nothing to do with that. People fight for religion. People spend billions and billions for converting others. But they themselves have not realized that is the meaning, that they have trying to spend lots of money, throw lots of money, killing others, doing harm others, burning, putting down religious places. All these are misunderstandings. Buddhism does not encourage. Some people came to Buddha and asked, having asked Dharma from Buddha, he said that I was following. Once said, he was the one who came to see the Buddha. He said, after listening to Buddha, I want to be a Buddhist or follower of. What the Buddha said, no, stick with your teacher. You don't need to follow, be a Buddhist. You can follow, but still stick to your teacher and take care of him, help him, support him. But practice the Dharma. This is the teaching of this is a unique character of any uncomparable. This is unique character of Buddha's teaching, Buddhism. We are not out for converting. We are not out for bribing people. No, we never force it. We just place the Dhamma. This is Dhamma. The same way Buddha what she said, Sister Kisa Gautami, do you understand that it is the impermanent? Nothing is permanent. So when she realized this, she reached a higher stage of spiritual awakening. At that time, Buddha said, Yoche vassa satan jive. Apassang amatam padam. Ekahang jivitam seyo. Passato amatam padam. This is so nice piece of advice. Like any other pieces of advice in the Dhammapada. This says, a single day's life of a person who sees the state of deathlessness is far greater than and nobler than the 100-year lifespan of a person who does not perceive the deathlessness state. You see how nice it is, how beautiful it is. So it is the understanding, seeing the things in their proper sense. Therefore, Buddha's teaching is, here this verse is enough for others to also understand impermanent nature of the life of everything. There he says the amatam padam. Amatam padam is a state of deathlessness. That's called nibbana. If you want to attain the nibbana, if you are afraid of the death, then Buddha said, stop the birth. Then automatically death will be stopped. The self-image of existence that we carry in our mind is created by the personalization of impersonal phenomena. Personalization of impersonal phenomena. Our existence or being is the continuation of this self-image called personality. When we have removed this self-image, through depersonalization, we cease to exist. When we cease to exist, we cease to die. Exist is a part of the birth, and death is also part of the birth, ultimate part. We cease to die. This is the deathlessness. To observe the experience of death as it comes and goes without personalizing it is to experience the deathlessness called nibbana, here and now, to experience it. This is the beautiful meaning of this verse. And the Kisagotami's life was completely changed, and he was able to stop birth. So there is no death is going to come to her. No more rebirth. If there is a birth, there is a death. Birth ends at death. The same way, this was the final life that Kisagotami had. Because after attaining the first stage, she entered the second, third, fourth stage, thereby stopped the rebirth. If you want to stop the death, come and see Buddha's teaching. It shows you how to stop birth. Because we think that to have a rebirth in heaven or somewhere is a pleasure. No, it is also another stop in the long journey of our samsara, we call birth and death, birth and death. So take this good example of this Kisha Gautami, how she realized it, how she put an end to the death. Yeah. And by stopping birth, automatically death was stopped. She attained the supreme bliss of Nibbana. That is the ultimate goal of Buddha's teaching. Buddha teaches us. If you want to see the Buddha's teaching, Buddha says, come and see me. Come and see me. Not come and believe. Come and see me. My Dharma, my teaching. That will help you to understand and to be free from all suffering forever. Not temporary. How to stop birth. May you all be well and happy.
That concludes today's program. If you have any questions about the contents of our broadcast, please feel free to reach out to us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. Our dedicated team remains committed to sharing the profound teachings of the Buddha, helping you walk the path of wisdom and enlightenment. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. Namo Buddhaya.